Good afternoon and welcome everyone. I am Mitty Figueredo, Deputy Director for Montgomery Parks, and I want to thank you for joining us this afternoon. Today, we are really excited to welcome Patsy Eubanks Owens to our Montgomery Parks Speaker Series to share her research on how parks can better serve teenagers. This is a topic that's very timely and important to us here at Montgomery Parks. Over the last few years, we've engaged in a concerted effort to focus on active, urban, and social parks. And this means designing parks that encourage physical activity and social connection. But unfortunately, when people think about attracting people to parks, they often focus on children and adults, and teenagers are seen as, at best, an afterthought, and at worst, a nuisance. And as a result, we end up encouraging the kinds of behaviors we want to prevent if we don't give them a place to engage with each other and positive outlets for their energies and interests. So I'm very interested in hearing what our speaker has to say about all of this today. But before we begin, I want to run through a few quick housekeeping items. First, we're recording this presentation and we will provide a link so that you can refer back to any information that's presented here. Second, I want to direct your attention to the Q&A box. This is where you can submit your questions or comments at any time. And at the end of the presentation, we're going to leave a few minutes for Q&A, and we'll try to get to as many of these questions as we can. So please do submit them as they occur to you during the presentation. And then next, for those of you who are pursuing continuing education credits through the American Planning Association's Professional Institute or the Landscape Architecture Continuing Education System, please click on the sign in link so we have a record of your attendance today. For those who may be joining us for the first time, I'd like to provide a brief introduction to our agency. We are located in Montgomery County, Maryland, a suburb of Washington, D.C., and we are part of the Maryland National Capital Park and Planning Commission, a bi-county agency that also includes our neighbor, Prince George's County. We are the proud recipients of 6 national gold medals for parks and recreation management, and our park system consists of 424 parks and over 37,000 acres of parkland, which is 10% of the land in our county. So let's get to today's topics. Teenagers and parks. We know that teen years are a key stage of life. This is a time when young people are forming their identity, and the public environment plays a critical role in their development. But teenagers are often overlooked or even excluded from public spaces through design and policy practices. So how can parks and cities better understand and serve our teenage population? Joining us today to share her insight on this is Patsy Eubanks Owens. Patsy is the Associate Dean and Professor of Landscape Architecture and Environmental Design at the University of California. Patsy has dedicated her career to exploring the role that physical environment has on the development, health, and well-being of youth, and served as a senior editor for the recently released Routledge Handbook of Designing Public Spaces for Young People. Patsy also holds a Bachelor of Landscape Architecture from the University of Georgia and a Master of Landscape Architecture from the University of California, Berkeley, and began her professional career in private practice in Philadelphia. So Patsy, welcome, and I am going to kick it off to you.
Great, thanks, Mitty. I really appreciate the introduction. I'm going to share my screen now. So hopefully I'm sharing the correct screen. As always with Zoom, want to make sure that we're not sharing personal things. So everyone can see my title slide. So.
We can.
Great, so thank you. So thanks for all of the folks joining today. What I will be talking about, as Mitty introduced us, is why it's important for us to consider adolescence in the design and planning of our public spaces. Most of us understand and accept the need for children to have opportunities to run and play, but we don't understand why it's important to design for teenagers. I know that in many cases, convincing others that including places for teens is actually one of the biggest hurdles, right? How do you tell somebody that we need to have these places for teenagers? Therefore, today, I'm really going to try to provide you some reasons that you can give to others of why this is important, but also then give you some examples of the kinds of places that you can design. So just as an overview, so you know what we're going to get into today, is I want to start with just a little bit of societal context, looking at what are these public perceptions, what is the role of public place, and what have we done currently in the public places we create. I'll talk about some of the places that teens like and why they like them. And then I want to talk about developmental tasks and that teenagers are going through, what's going on in the developmental process during the adolescent years. But then how is that linked to design and how is that linked to the physical space? I'll give you some design issues to consider and some examples. And then if we have time, I'll end a little bit with talking about some of my research. So as far as the societal context, the public perceptions really is that, as Mitty mentioned, that there's a negative perception of teenagers is widespread. Without thinking, adults assume that a group of teenagers are going to be causing trouble, or if they're not causing trouble, they're going to be causing trouble soon. Years ago, a fellow landscape architecture faculty member came in one morning and confessed to me that he had gone outside of his house to put out the trash, and there was a small group of teenagers sitting on a bench close by. And his immediate response was to yell at them and tell them that they needed to go home, right? That they shouldn't be there. Reflecting on his action, he realized that he was really out of place. It was early in the evening. They weren't doing anything wrong. They were just sitting there talking, but that was his immediate reaction. And I think this really illustrates how that's not uncommon, right? He's not alone in that kind of visceral reaction to seeing young people. The other piece of this is that the public perception is really conjures up these images, right, of delinquency and violence. And the images that we have in popular media and news reports, it really reinforces those things. So we keep building on this perception. When adults do think about teens and what they're doing, they generally try to think of things, well, what can we do to keep them out of trouble? Parents will sign them up for sports teams and other after-school activities, just anything to keep them busy. When I've asked young people why they've joined certain clubs or they do certain things, they parrot what they've heard from adults in their lives. They say, well, it's just something to keep me out of trouble. And I think that's really sad. My argument is that they should be doing the things that they want to do, that they enjoy doing it. They should be doing these things not just merely to keep them busy. The other piece of the looking about society and how teens fit into it is understanding the role of public spaces. In our society, the role of public space has really changed from earlier decades. Although we've seen a surge in the use of public spaces in our streets in recent months, particularly for protest, but also the reclaiming of some public streets for outdoor dining and things like that. In general, our public spaces are no longer seen as an open space for spontaneous social meetings. Those kind of activities occur, or at least they did before the pandemic, at coffee shops and supermarkets and health clubs. Now in public places, you have to have a reason to be there. You have to be seen as legitimate. Teenagers still need those kind of public places to have for their social gatherings. And in some cases, they use those public places for recreation, which we'll talk about a little bit more. This, again, has been particularly true during the last 13 months during the COVID pandemic, is that young people have really needed places to get outside and opportunities to do things. And those opportunities have really been limited. More so for adolescents than for other age groups, public spaces are an important role in their lives. Some researchers suggest that these are the only places that youth can claim for themselves, that they provide a legitimate place for young people to be. Another issue is that many of our public places today are actually privately owned. And that means that security forces or whatever can actually prevent access from anyone that they don't like the way that they're behaving. Shopping malls are an obvious example of these kind of places. In the bottom left, you'll see this is actually from the Mall of America in Minneapolis. If you know about the Mall of America, or maybe you've been there, you know it's actually huge, right? There is a whole carnival inside it with lots of a roller coaster and rides. There's multiplex of movie theaters. So it's a place that really invites young people to come. but they've actually instituted a policy that no one under 16 can be there on the weekends after 6 o'clock. As a parent, and knowing what my daughters were like when they were 14 and 15, this is the kind of place I would want them to be able to go to, right? That they could go with their friends. They're in a controlled setting. They're in a place where I would feel more comfortable about it. And yet we've really restricted their use. Also, that we see this privately owned aspect of spaces in some of our public plazas, that they are actually also controlled and are private. The other thing I wanted to mention is one of the through trends that we've seen as well is in the revitalization effort of public spaces in some communities. They've actually been undertaken with a specific objective of removing those undesirable users, and that includes the homeless and the teenagers. When Union Square in San Francisco was redesigned, the charge that designers were given was to make sure the skateboarders can't go through the park. And so we've actually done things like that, but the removing of benches is really common, or at least making the benches so uncomfortable nobody's going to want to stay there for any time. And so this actually leads me to my next point about the role of public space, and that is the exclusion of teenagers. I first got involved in looking at teens and the use of space when I was in graduate school at Berkeley. I was working on a design project for the redesign of the commercial area. And there were these teenagers kept goofing off, right? Hanging around outside the BART station, the rapid transit station. And it was really watching them and trying to learn from them that was my inspiration for trying to learn more about what adolescents need and how that we can actually design for them. Why did they pick this heavily used plaza to hang out, and how could it be better designed so that their activities didn't interfere with others? A few years later, I sent out a survey to landscape architects around the country, asking for examples of places they had designed for teens. I wanted to get some really good examples that I could share with other people. And instead, every response I got back said, well, actually, I've never designed a place for teen, but this is how I've been asked to not have teens in a place, to design it so it would not be welcoming to them. And so that sort of set me on a different path. And I will say today, we haven't come much farther as far as a design profession about designing for places for teens. It's really difficult to find good examples. Our history is both that the public policies that we put in place, as well as these design practices, seek to ban or limit the use of public places for teens. The policies such as skateboarding bans, loitering ordinances, curfew laws, they're often adopted in an effort to keep kids off the streets. They restrict when the teens can use places, what places they can use, and the kinds of things that they can actually do there. As you might expect, I heard from several designers who have been asked to redesign, to get rid of the skateboarding. Communities often spend a lot of money putting skate stops, like you'll see in this top image, along walls, to prevent the skateboarders from sliding along them. They, spend money on building skate parks, typically in out-of-the-way places. My research on skateboard parks has actually shown that the motivation behind building them isn't altruistic. It's not that we want to provide a wonderful place for our young people, the skateboarders to go and to perfect their skills. But often the motivation is that, well, if we build them a skate park, then we can ban them from every place else in the community. And that's really unfortunate, because many teens actually use their skateboard for transportation, and that there's other things that we have to consider. When we do design features in parks that young people like, the response is typically to tell them they can't use it. A really good example that I've seen in many communities is a children's play area, right? The children's play area has been designed for younger children, but the teenagers have discovered that the tower in the middle is actually a great place to sit out with their friends on Friday and Saturday nights. And so that there's often, signs such as the one here, that tell them that the playground isn't designed for you. You can't be here. You don't belong. In Davis, there was once a really wonderful teen hangout. The photos I have of it, unfortunately, were taken at night, so they're not great. But this plaza that you see in the top image is located next to a parking lot and across the street from a very popular pizza place. It used to have 3 levels. It used to have 3 steps that just, it was just all concrete. And the teenagers would go pick up a slice of pizza and come and hang out on the steps. I thought it was a wonderful place, right? They weren't hiding, they were in public view, they had found something cheap to eat, and they were out where everybody could see them. Well, some people complained, and the city decided to turn this into a planter. And for a couple of years at least, they actually programmed it on Friday and Saturday nights to have a string quartet. And so they would actually have music here. So the teens had to go someplace else, and a lot of the teens end up, get removed, and you don't see them anymore. Another example, and the bottom image illustrates, is one of the community parks in Davis actually had a fire pit. And it was a really popular place that teens would sit around and gather, and anybody could sort of reserve it and have a place. And again, neighbors complained, and they took out the fire pit. And in its place, they put in a zip line. And so the zip line is actually something, I think this one's maybe from Landscape Structures, the company. And it's something that the playground manufacturers have been thinking about designing things for older children, for teens. And during the pandemic, a lot of our play equipment has been closed down, but everything's reopened except for the zip line. And the zip line is still chained up. There's a sign there that limits when it can be used. They come and close it up every day. And on Nextdoor, on the social media platform, a lot of neighbors are back and forth, some complaining that it's not been reopened. They want a place for their kids to go, for their older kids to go, and others are complaining that it should just be taken out. The other thing I wanted to mention here about the exclusion of teens is sometimes it's unintentional. We don't really understand what we're doing. Particularly interesting to designers and planners are some of the comments we've received from young people about their neighborhoods. One woman, she was talking to us about changes in her neighborhood, and she thought that the larger homes with their garages meant that she never saw her neighbors. She didn't know who lived next door, and that they didn't have any interest in getting to know her either. Back in 1999, some of you will remember the disastrous shootings at the Columbine High School. Some people after that event actually went so far to talk about the isolation of the suburbs and what the suburbs are doing to our young people and how they are disconnected from their community and where they live. This was actually an article that came out in the New York Times shortly after that event. And so I think it's important for us to think about those longer term implications of our design and planning decisions. Many teens have told me about places in their communities where they don't feel welcome. And this isn't just skateboarders, it's just if you're of a certain age that you don't belong, right? That you shouldn't be there. They want to feel like they're part of the community, and they also want to have pride in the community. If we can't get to a point where the public recognizes that teens have a legitimate use of our park, then I think we're in trouble. And I think I'm here today to ask all of you to help start making that point to other people, is that this is really important, that this is part of the developmental process. So why should we design for teens? I've talked a lot about what we're doing wrong, but how can we make communities better places for our young people to grow up? Let's begin by looking at the places that teens like and why they like them, and how these places contribute and how they're essential to their healthy development. And I'm going to repeat that. This is really important of understanding how places contribute and are essential to their healthy development. just like we think about playgrounds and how those help in the development of little kids, right, to develop their gross motor skills, to learn how to get along with their friends, we have that same obligation about designing for teenagers. This is a strong argument that we need to make to other people, right, and that we need that especially those who really don't want to include young people in their public spaces. So what I want to do before I go to the next slide is I want everybody just to take a moment and to think back to when you were a teen. Think back to the places you went to, things you did there, and who you did them with, why these places were important to you. Now that everybody has some memory of places, I'm going to share with you some answers I've gotten from other adults. These are actually adult drawings from other presentations I've done when we were in person, and I could actually send out pieces of paper and crayons for people to use. But the kinds of things that we've heard is that it's really important to have a place to be with friends, to hang out, but also places to be with nature. Places that were calming and relaxing, places where you could sort of get away, places where you felt safe, but also places where you could try new things and challenge new ideas. And yeah, party, hang out with your friends, and maybe do some things that you shouldn't be doing, but that you did want to experiment with some of those things. So maybe we can talk about in the chat, maybe some of these things or things that occurred to you as well. So I actually went through and looked at, took my research, but also research of others, and sort of identifying the kind of places that are valued by youth. Developed parks are up there. Also undeveloped lands, particularly in some areas where there's agricultural lands or where people can find lots and things where nothing is built, but also places at school, places at home. More natural parks, places that are a little bit more removed, and of course, commercial areas and street settings. So developed parks, are really important. And I think for you and for this audience today, we're going to talk a little bit more. We're going to come back to parks. But the reasons that the young people value places are also important. Places where they can be with their friends, places where they can get away, where they can engage in recreational activities, and also places where they can be with nature. And so we'll talk about these a little bit more. And so the activities, when you look at parks and the places that they go, the activities they engage in are sports. And these can be formal, part of a team, but also informal, having a pickup game of soccer or whatever, or ultimate frisbee. Also individual activities they did were important to them, swimming or skateboarding, but also this whole idea, what they would tell me is chilling, just a place to chill, to talk, to watch other people. And these kinds of activities were important to them because, one, they like to have a place close to home, a place that's easy for them to get to, a place that doesn't cost them anything. It's a place where they can be with friends, but I think it's also important to note that they talk about it's important because they can be with their family and they can be with other people in the community as well, where they can relax, get some exercise, give them something to do, and also just a place where they feel like they belong. So this is from one of the projects I worked on in a community. It's called West Sacramento. It's between Davis and Sacramento. Teens want to have places for them beyond the soccer fields and basketball courts. But like many communities, playgrounds are only for the younger children. One of the places that the teens in this community took us to was a local playground. And they told us, they said, we have a nice park in our neighborhood, right? But we really don't feel welcome here unless we're playing soccer or we're on another sport on a team. We can't just come here with our friends to talk. And sometimes we would just want to come here to play. We like to swing, but the adults don't want us to do that. They talk about how the neighbors would tell them they shouldn't be there if they're just hanging out and just wanting to talk with that. And as I mentioned earlier, right, the features we do put in the park designs for young people, neighbors complain and ask us to remove them. So I'm going to switch and turn our attention now to thinking about development and what are the development tasks of adolescents. There's four that I want to focus on, and I'm going to go through each of these, and we'll talk about, I'll give you some examples of how those present themselves in the places that we design. But they're managing free time effectively, developing satisfying social relationships, developing a sense of social responsibility, and also having self-reflection and internal growth. And so for each of these, that there are different ways that they manifest in a physical place, right? Into a place that we might design or that we might plan. And I'll go through each of these and have some image to illustrate some of these points. So the idea of managing free time, right? Researchers have suggested that adolescents need to learn how to spend time on their own, right? They need to learn how to find enjoyment and satisfaction in activities that they choose to do. The common and frequent cry of an adolescent is, "I'm bored," and that's a symptom of that struggle, that they need to learn how to use that unstructured time. Young people find opportunities to effectively manage their free time throughout their neighborhood and communities. There's not just one place where they can do that, but looking for places that give them something to do, where they can participate in different recreation, where they can hang out and talk to other people, and where it's easy for them to get to, have really all come up as elements that are important to them when they're thinking about these places and how they manage their free time. The other thing that I think most people are real familiar with, and because it's so visible that we can actually see young people developing their social relationships, right? Researchers identify that learning how to build these satisfying social relationships is one of the key areas that young people need to get good at. That includes the relationships with their peers, but it also includes relationships with families, at their school, and in their communities. The long-established relationships with parents starts to change during adolescence. The family is no longer the center of all their social activities. Friends become to play a more central role. And young people need to learn how to reach group decisions, to solve conflicts, to work with others through these things. And so that's part of what we have, relationships that we go through with relationships. Teens go to the mall, they go to cafes, parks, neighborhoods, schools, all these places to be with their friends. And although adults see this hanging out as unproductive use of the time, is actually a very important and very productive use of the time. This is really an important part of their growing up and of their identity formation. The next is the idea of sense of social responsibility, right? That this is a developmental task that's really important for young people, that they need to be able to experiment with adult roles without taking on all the associated responsibilities with adults. They need to have time to develop their own sets of ideals. And these things include developing that sense of societal respect for societal rules and cultural rules, that they need to understand what the standards are for correct behaviors, understand the difference between right and wrong, and for respecting other people. For many of the young people that I've talked with, the activities they've engaged in and the reasons that they gave for liking a place included being able to have a voice in the decisions about the places that they go to and that they use. This is particularly comes up time and time again, talking about schools, right? That they never ask, even though we spend all our time here, we never ask what we think. Having these places where they feel like they belong, also opportunities where they can work or learn new skills. And sometimes it means also engaging in or reacting to other antisocial behaviors, right? Testing the boundaries. What can they do? I think back to the teens I saw at the BART station, right? They were sort of testing the limits. What could they get away with? What would people be accepting of? And how could they, what could they do in this space? And then the fourth developmental task is this idea of self-reflection and internal growth. It's a critical time for these individuals to develop their self-identity. It's a period of time for reflection. Although this growth occurs for the individual, it's also those interactions with others that help young people along in that process. To gain a clearer sense of identity, youth experiment with different roles, and that may include spending time with different peer groups. At different points as they're, in their teenage years. You might think back to your own, time of growing up and how you maybe spent some time with one group of teens and then you shifted to another. Helps you figure out who you are. In addition, young people seek role models, both from within their peer group, but also from adults. And it's really important that adults understand their role as being as a role model for them. When talking about places are important to teens, that they mentioned places where they could sit and think, where they can help them make decisions, figure out their place in the world. These are often places that have very naturalistic characteristics, places in nature, and also places where they feel safe. I'm going to come back to this. There's a concept called prospect refuge. Prospect refuge is a place where you can look out. So you feel like you're on top of the world, you can see things, but a refuge where you feel protected and safe. So I wanted to turn our attention now to, well, what do we do with this information, right? How do we turn this into a physical space and the kinds of places that we can design? And I went back, this is actually something I wrote about years ago in Landscape Architecture magazine, and I've sort of made these three buckets. We have hangouts, lookouts, and wipeouts. And if we can think about these kind of really diverse kind of places for teens, we can make a really good start to creating places. Before we get into them though, I want to identify or talk about three big hurdles I see when you're thinking about designing for a young person, for a teenager. One is teens aren't very likely to embrace a place that they're told to use. Right? If you put a place in the park and you say, this is going to be the teen hangout place, they're not going to use it, right? So you have to have the characteristics in place and they have to discover it. And one way to get around that though, is to have them involved in making the decisions and in designing the place. The second hurdle is that not all teenagers are the same. They don't all like to do the same kind of things, just like adults. This is one problem I've seen that has come up in the design of youth centers or in teen centers, is often what happens is that youth center will be commandeered by one group of teens, and then the others don't want to come to it. And so you really have to intervene with thinking about programming and different activities so it can be something different for different groups of teens at different times. And then third, back to the reoccurring theme, here is that no matter what you do, adults are going to complain. And you have to know that's going to happen and you have to figure out how to work around that. So I'll go through each of these and just give you some examples. The idea of hangouts is the place where they can be with friends. This is the image on the left is actually a group of young women at a high school. That at schools are always trying to find a place to hang out, and we don't really design those places for them. Some of my research has taken me into, some of you are probably familiar with CPTED, crime prevention through environmental design. If you look at some of the early works in CPTED, they actually looked at how do we assess what are the activities that people want to engage in, and then how do we change our designs so it helps to make that activity legitimate. And the two drawings in the middle are from a book by Tim Crow, where he actually looked at activities at schools, at high schools, and said, teens want to stop and talk to their friends in the hallway. Teachers complain. They make the passing break, shorter, so they have to move along. Instead of doing that, why don't we design places where they can stop and talk to each other? And the same thing applies. The drawing at the bottom talks about, after school. Young people want to hang out with their friends and talk after school. We often tell them they can't loiter on the school grounds. We push them off somewhere else. Instead of doing that, why don't we think about having a place where they feel comfortable and where they're visible, close to the school for those hangout places. Some playground play equipment manufacturers have begun to do some research. This is a piece by Compan. I'm not sure if it's available now. I actually tried to find it in their catalog just recently, but they've done research about how teens sit and how they use. If you've ever watched a teenager, they don't sit on a bench like the rest of us, right? But they perch, they sit on the back, they lean. And so they've designed equipment like this. As I mentioned, Landscape Structures also has done some research and has some pieces that you can find for adolescents as well. The idea of lookouts, how we design places that they could have these opportunities for self-reflection. These are those places where they like to get away. And sometimes this is by themselves, but it can also be with their friends. And I mentioned the Prospect Refuge. And so these are two examples that young people have taken me to. One is a rose garden where you can actually, you've got sort of plantings all behind you. You can sit there and then you can look out and you have this really great view. Another is in a state park that's really close to a community that's in the Bay Area. And it's called Rock City, and it has these wonderful little crevices and nooks and crannies that people can sit in alone or sit in with their friends. And then you can look out, you peek out, and you have these great views. In a community like Davis, there aren't very many natural opportunities for Prospect Refuges. Davis is in the Central Valley. It's really flat. But in talking to my children when they were in school, and then also things I see in our neighborhood, is they still find places for Prospect Refuge. Just less than a month ago, I was walking by the neighborhood school, and there were several young women sitting up on the rooftop. And so I went later, and I could figure out how they got up there, right? So not gonna tell the school board, not gonna tell other people because I don't want to take away their place. But I know my own daughter confessed to me that at one of the other schools in town, one of the roofs that they would get up to and sit. And I also know that on campus, one of the highest buildings on campus is a place where teenagers go to find that Prospect Refuge. They like to be up and looking at other things and seeing what's around them. And then the last kind of place is I've called the wipeouts, but it's not necessarily just about skateboarding. It can also be other kind of more active recreational activities. And so one thing I wanted to mention, because I know there's been some discussion in your community about skateboarding and skate parks, things to keep in mind is that one is that skate parks really need places for people to sit. A lot of skate parks get built without that. If you look at the image in the middle here, the skateboarders often will be there for hours at a time, and they like to take a break. They like to get something to eat. I've talked to teens at the skate park here in Davis, and they've had a battle back and forth with the city. The young people bring seats in, and the city removes them, and then finally they've got the city to build some boxes and some opportunities. But also in this design of thinking about viewing areas, skateboarding is pretty cool, and a lot of people enjoy watching skateboarders do it. And so instead of putting a skate park in a remote area and making it totally isolated, is designing it into part of a community park. And I don't know if you can see, but in the top image on the right, there's actually a bridge and there's an overlook, which is what the view is from the bottom right image. And so people will pass through as part of the trail that goes through the park, and people pass through and they will pause and they will look and they will see what's going on. And so those are really great things to keep in mind when you're doing a skate park. the last thing is to remember that not all skateboarders are the same either, right? There's wide disparity as far as their skill level. There can be very extreme differences in ages. I've seen skateboarders as young as 8, and as old as 28. And so you have to think about that. I also wanted to leave you with an idea about designing for skateboarders and thinking about looking at areas that they already use and adapting those areas. Instead of investing in a whole new skate park, why not embrace the place that they've already used? How can that use be supported, and the use of other people maybe that are trying to use that space can continue? A great example is actually in San Francisco. There's a plaza that skateboarders use. So why not think about how we design that and support that instead of putting our money into a whole new place, because they like to be seen, they like to be out where other people are. Then I wanted to just wrap up here. I think a really important piece of our work is thinking about youth engagement. And this really should go beyond workshops. And I could give you a whole other lecture on this about community involvement, but I just wanted to hit on a few things. It's not just about having a workshop. It's not just about having a youth council. And there's 4 points I want to make. Is one, treat them as partners, right? That what are the issues that they're concerned about? What are the skills and knowledge that they can bring to this? And also that young people can be great conduits into the adults and into families. They can be a way to also get their parents involved. The second thing is what I mentioned earlier, is that giving them ownership and giving them a role in the community. This is a really important thing to do. How do you engage them? Thinking about the ways that you can reach a teen audience. What are the ways that you can talk to them to get them excited on a project? This is a project the one in West Sacramento, where we used video cameras and photography. We did a lot of online mapping. The youth put together this wonderful public fair that they shared information. They actually set up a video booth where they videoed the mayor and did all sorts of things. And then lastly, since I'm speaking, I think most of the audience today are designers and planners, that we need to all be advocates. That as designers, we have an opportunity to inform the public and to influence how the places we design and create can be more than just a pretty place. The places we create really are for the social good. Our professional license obliges us to protect the public health, safety, and welfare. And as I've described today, the places we help to create have an important role in doing just that, right, for adolescents. We need to take an active role in informing the broader public that hanging out in downtown by a group of young people is not unhealthy behavior. It's actually, in fact, a very important part of their development, and they need opportunities to be able to do that and to engage in other people. So I would just leave you with, as Mita said, I've been working with young people for a long time. If you go to Google Scholar and you put in my name, a whole list of publications comes up, and you can actually click on it and read those. I know some of you might be interested in the article about skateboard parks. There's another one, I don't think I even have it up here, about the exclusion of teens. It's called No Teens Allowed. And then also, as mentioned, that we have this new book that came out, and I want to let you know it's a very expensive book, but we negotiated with the publisher because we wanted to get this information out to people who are advocating for designing places for adolescents. If you go to Routledge's website, search for this book, the Handbook of Designing Public Spaces for Young People, scroll down to the bottom. There's a link that will take you to free downloads of what we call the takeaway pages. So we have chapters that are all about why it's important to design for teens, and we have chapters about how to do it. And each of those has a takeaway page that gives you key talking points. And we're hoping people will be able to use these when they're putting together, say, a funding proposal to an agency, or if you're giving a presentation to a public audience. And so we'd really like to for you to take advantage of those kind of things. And then lastly, I wanted to mention I have a new project going on. It's called Growing Up in Cities. I'm leading an effort. It's called Growing Up in Cities in North America. And we are partnering with 4 child-friendly city initiative communities. And one of those is your neighbor, Prince George's County. And so we're working with the folks there to identify, looking at health and the relationship between health outcomes and the physical environment. And so hopefully we'll have something that we can share with you later on that. And then I just wanted to end by giving a shout out to all my research partners. The young people that I've worked with, I really could not have gotten as far as I have of learning about young people without them really trusting me and sharing these their ideas with me. So I'll stop sharing my screen. Or should I keep it up? Are there questions that relate to images?
I think you can probably stop sharing, Patsy, and we can do some Q&A, and that way folks can see you while you answer. So there was so much that resonated in this presentation. I sort of don't even know where to begin. I do want to comment on just a couple of things that really sort of spoke to me. I really liked how you categorized chilling as being one of these acceptable activities that teenagers need and want to do, and that it's part of their development as human beings, and that you actually want them doing it where everyone else can also kind of see them doing it, and they're part of this community instead of sort of effectively ostracized. And, you know, it does lead me, I mean, it's some of the things that you talk about are almost a little heartbreaking, and it does lead me to wonder, I mean, we were all teenagers, and this is more of like a philosophical question. How is it that we just, so many of us have completely forgotten what it was like to be a teenager? That seems to be a recurring theme. And then I just really, you know, I've never seen that categorization of spaces designed to, you know, accommodate and welcome kids as being hangouts, lookouts, and wipeouts. And that's great. That's great. Because we tend to think of like the wipeout, we tend to think of the space that's specifically designed for an actual activity, and we forget some of the other things that they, again, need and want to do. So with that, you know, maybe we can do a couple, you know, take a couple questions. So, you know, you at the very end, you were talking about, you know, how important it is to engage teenagers in the process. And one thing, I think we were chatting about this right before the presentation, the pandemic has taught us is that we can do a lot of community outreach remotely. I mean, our traditional model in planning of any kind is that, you know, we hold public meetings in the evening that people show up in person. And, you know, we all know what the sort of demographic profile of those people is. You know, it's tend to be relatively affluent, older, you know, not very diverse. And one thing that we've noticed is that doing a lot of our public outreach via, you know, the internet has actually kind of broadened participation. And so along those lines, is that something that you think we might want to keep doing going forward? And would that help us get more young people to participate in this process if they know that they can give input via their computer?
Yes, I think so. There's a lot of social media, right? And it's not just, you know, participating in a webinar or whatever for young people. There's other ways for them to participate using social media as well. And that I think we have, I know the city of San Francisco, I'm working with them as part of this child-friendly city initiative and the Growing Up in Cities project. And they've been having a lot of virtual meetings, and I participated in some of those where they can actually, you know, talk to the mayor and bring ideas and questions to the mayor, and having that kind of, you know, chat, you know, coffee with the mayor kind of thing. So definitely opportunities like that. I know with the young people we worked with is we created a Google map, and they could just upload videos and photographs of anything they wanted to tell us about, right? And so it was a really great storytelling that they then sort of refined and edited and put it together and shared it with the mayor and showed it, you know, shared it with planning officials and other things. And so there's, you know, lots of creative ways to do it. And what I have found is the young people are better at figuring out what's going to be the best way to do that, right? Than you know, the adults. And so giving them that little bit of freedom, and they just come up with really creative ways.
Yeah. No, that's great. Another thing that you mentioned, I mean, you were talking about skateboarding, and you mentioned that we want to restrict, for example, we say, okay, well, here's a skate park. Don't even think about skateboarding anyplace else, right? But they use the skateboard, some of them, as transportation. But that led me to think about, when we think about where we want to locate some of these amenities that are geared more toward young people, like skate parks and things like that. We're thinking, well, we want to put them kind of in locations that are maybe accessible to public transportation so that kids can reach them. And, how we've kind of designed these auto-oriented suburbs, unfortunately, leaves kids who don't have cars or can't yet drive. And we know that young people are getting their driver's licenses later and later. They're sort of like, they're isolated out in these places. And I wonder what role transportation options and public transportation play in getting people to the public spaces where we want them to, chill with their friends and engage in activity.
Yeah, thanks for asking that. Actually, the young people in Sacramento, the other researchers were doing, quantitative and qualitative research and writing white papers. So the young people I work with, they didn't want to write a white paper. So we wrote a comic book. And so the comic book actually focused on 4 things, and transportation was one of the things they focused on, and how transportation planning was really done for the worker, right, for the commuter. And so they gave an example as for where the high school was compared to where the public health clinic was. You had to take like 2 or 3 buses. It was literally a straight shot if the bus went one way. So it would take them like 3 hours if they had to leave school for a public health clinic appointment, where if they had a car, it would take 20 minutes. And so they gave that as one illustration. And so we've tried to talk to the transportation planners and thinking about how do we change who you're prioritizing and how these routes get decided, because that has been, the tradition in most communities as we design it. We have more buses during the early morning or in the afternoon, at the end of the workday, or we have express routes or whatever, and it's to get people from their work centers back into the neighborhoods. But we don't design it for the young people, and they're the ones who are using the buses, not the middle class workers for the most part.
Yeah, so, that's right. Yeah, that's a really important comment. So you kind of mentioned at the end that one of the things that we have to sort of, adjust ourselves to, that we have to contend with, is the fact that there is going to be pushback from adults who have sort of this knee-jerk reaction that if there's a bunch of teenagers attracted to something or hanging out, it's automatically bad. Like that's a social negative. You want to disperse them, right? But I like to think that some people can be swayed and that their perceptions of this kind of thing can change over time. Do you have any, ideas to share about how to begin to influence public perception of teenagers and it's sort of teach people they're not automatically a threat?
Right. Yeah. So, I think this idea of us being advocates is really important, but I actually think the message is stronger when it comes from the young people themselves. I know when we did the public event, some people were just really blown away that the young people care. Like they talked about, trash, and they talked about graffiti. And the adults were like, well, you guys are the one doing it. We're like, no, we're not. We want it to look pretty. We want the place to look clean. We like it when you plant new flowers and that we can see these things. And so the adults were sort of blown away that young people even cared about some of those issues. And so I think the message is actually stronger, is to work with young people and partners in reaching out to the community. I think, Mitty, you made the point early on that, why can't we remember what it was like? I think one of the problems is we do remember, and we remember some of the bad things we did, and we don't want our children doing those things and making those mistakes. But what we have to do is you have to realize you learned something for making that mistake, and you did it in an environment where you really didn't get yourself into trouble, right?
Yeah.
You had parents there to pull you out, or you had things. And so we need to allow them to mess up. It's just like with little kids, you need to allow them to climb, right? They're never going to be able to do things, or, if you keep pushing them down or telling them not to go, climb on a structure or whatever it is. So
that's so true. And it's so funny that you referenced that, because I think a year or two ago, pre-pandemic, we had a speaker who came out and spoke about designing places for like playgrounds for younger children. And she talked about how you actually want them to engage in like some kind of risk taking, because that's how they actually learn what their limitations are. And obviously that continues into the teen years. And, as to your comment about teenagers being their own best advocates, I mean, we see that here. I think that recently we've had a discussion in Montgomery County about school boundaries. And some of the most compelling testimony has come from young people at some of these hearings who've really educated themselves about these issues. And then everyone is just blown away, because you forget that they are emerging adults with thoughts and feelings and, observations of their own. And, I think that's great feedback. And we will definitely try to incorporate that as we move forward, and also think about how to design our public spaces, not just the skateboard parks and the bike parks, but other public spaces to kind of make them more welcome and provide them sort of a safe space to do their thing.
I think our young people today are much smarter and savvier than they have been in past generations, and we need to let them soar, right? Let them use that.
Agreed. So I think we're just about ready to wrap it up, unless we have any other last minute questions that folks want to bounce to me. But I do want to again thank you for this presentation. It's been it was very eye-opening. I've been very sort of galvanized by it. So I do want to let everyone joining us today remind them that our next speaker series event is on May 18th. We're going to be joined by Gil Peñalosa and Jennifer Holtz. She's from AARP Maryland, who will share information on how parks can best serve another important segment of our population, which is older adults. The same principles apply. Active lifestyles and opportunities for social engagement are important for all of us. And we serve all Montgomery County residents in all segments of every demographic. So we hope you can join us. Thanks again. And all of you have a great rest of your afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you.